She thought she was just being kind to a man in trouble, a simple act of defiance against the harshness of her world. She never imagined that by hiding one man from the police, she would summon an army to her door. The bell above the door of the daily grind hadn't jingled with a new customer in over an hour. For me, Ilara, that sound was the rhythm of my life, the metronome counting down the seconds until rent was due. Tonight, it was silent, leaving me alone with the hum of the old refrigerator and the rhythmic drumming of rain against the window. The streets of Ironwood, a town forged in steel, and now rusting in neglect, were slick and empty. Each passing headlight felt like a fleeting promise, a hope that would swerve into some other, happier establishment. I was wiping down the same sticky patch of Formica countertop for the third time when the door finally burst open, a gust of wind and rain chasing a man inside. He wasn't a regular. In a town where everyone knew everyone's grandfather, a new face was an event. This one was different. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with a face that looked like it had been carved from oak and left out in the weather. His suit, though impeccably tailored, was soaked through, clinging to a frame that was both powerful and weary. He moved with a quiet urgency, his eyes dark and sharp, scanning the empty diner before landing on me. There was no menace in his gaze, but there was a storm in there, a history I couldn't begin to guess at. He didn't ask for a menu. He just slid into the farthest booth, the one with the torn vinyl seat that everyone avoided, and sank into the shadows. I grabbed a coffee pot, the dark liquid sloshing comfortingly, and walked over. "Rough night out there," I said, my voice sounding small in the cavernous silence. He just nodded, his eyes fixed on the door. I poured him a mug, the steam rising to meet his tired face. He didn't thank me. He just wrapped his hands around the warmth of the ceramic, as if it were a lifeline. I retreated to my counter, pretending to be busy, but my attention was tethered to him. Something was wrong. It wasn't just the rain or the late hour, it was the way he sat, perfectly still but radiating a kind of coiled energy, like a predator trying to appear harmless. Then I saw it, a dark, blossoming stain on the sleeve of his jacket, just above the cuff. It was subtle, but under the flickering fluorescent lights, it was undeniably the color of blood. My heart hammered against my ribs. Ironwood had its share of trouble, small-time crooks and desperate kids, but this felt different. This felt like something that had wandered in from a bigger, more dangerous world. Before I could process the fear, the wail of a siren cut through the night, growing louder, closer. The man's head snapped up, his jaw tight. He looked at me, and for the first time his eyes held a plea. It was a silent, desperate question. "Help me!" The sirens were screaming now, painting the wet street in strobing flashes of red and blue. They were stopping right outside. 2 police cars. My mind raced. This man, a stranger with blood on his sleeve, was bringing trouble I couldn't afford. My daughter, Maya, was sleeping in the small apartment upstairs. My first instinct, my only instinct, was to protect her. But then I looked at his face again, at the deep lines of exhaustion and something that looked like honor, however misplaced. And I made a decision that would change everything. The police would be at the door any second. What would you do? Would you open that door? The knock on the glass was sharp, authoritative. 2 uniformed officers stood on the other side of the door, their faces obscured by the rain and the glare of their own flashing lights. My hand was frozen on the handle of the coffee pot. Every rational thought screamed at me to point to the back booth, to hand over the trouble that had walked into my life uninvited. It was the safe thing to do, the smart thing. My life was a fragile tower of unpaid bills and half-realized dreams. It couldn't withstand a storm. But the man in the booth hadn't moved. He simply watched me, his expression unreadable, leaving the choice entirely in my hands. It was the absence of pressure, the quiet dignity in his surrender to my judgment, that tipped the scale. Taking a deep breath, I walked to the door and opened it just a crack, letting in a sliver of the cold, wet night. "Evening, officers." "Everything all right?" I tried to keep my voice steady, to sound like a tired waitress at the end of a long, empty shift. The older of the two, a man with a thick mustache and a weary disposition I recognized from around town, peered past me into the diner. "Evening, Alara. We're looking for someone. Saw a man matching his description head this way. Older fella, dark suit. You seen anyone like that?" My heart felt like a trapped bird beating against my ribs. I could feel the stranger's gaze on my back, a silent wait. This was it. The moment to choose. Lying to the police was a line I'd never crossed. I was the kind of person who paid for a newspaper she could have easily lifted from the stand. But protecting Maya meant more than just following rules. It meant surviving. And something primal, an instinct I didn't know I possessed, told me that the man in my booth was less of a threat than the world he was running from. "No, officer," I said, the lie tasting like rust in my mouth. "It's been dead all night. Just me and the rain." I forced a small, tired smile. The officer held my gaze for a moment too long, his eyes searching mine for a flicker of deceit. I held my breath, praying he couldn't hear the frantic pounding in my chest. He finally gave a curt nod, his shoulders slumping with the same exhaustion I felt. "All right, well, keep your door locked. There's some bad business tonight." He didn't elaborate. He just turned, and he and his partner retreated back into the swirling chaos of lights and rain. I watched until their taillights vanished down the block before slowly closing the door, the click of the lock echoing in the sudden silence. My legs felt weak, and I leaned against the cool glass, my forehead pressed against it. The diner was quiet again, save for the hum of the refrigerator. I had done it. I had lied to the police. For a stranger. For a man who might be a criminal. A killer. A wave of nausea washed over me. What had I just done? I turned, my eyes drawn to the back booth. The man was still there, watching me. He slowly, deliberately reached into his pocket. My body tensed, a fresh wave of fear overriding the last. Was this where my kindness was rewarded with a threat? Was this the moment I would regret? He didn't pull out a weapon. His hand emerged from his jacket holding a small, worn leather wallet. With deliberate, almost pained slowness, he extracted $100 bill and placed it carefully on the table. He then pushed himself up, his movements stiff, and walked towards the door. He paused beside my counter, his presence filling the small space. Up close, I could see the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the grey in his dark hair. He smelled of rain, wool, and something else. Something metallic and faintly sweet that I now recognized as blood. "Thank you," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. It held no apology, no explanation, just a simple, profound statement of gratitude. He didn't say what he was thanking me for, the coffee, the lie, the momentary sanctuary. It was for all of it. He looked towards the back of the diner, in the direction of the stairs that led to my apartment. "You have a family?" The question was soft, but it landed like a physical blow. A cold dread seeped into my veins. How did he know? Had he been watching me? My protective instincts flared, hot and fierce. "That's none of your business," I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. A flicker of something, regret perhaps, crossed his face. "You're right, it isn't." He reached into his wallet again and pulled out another $100 bill, then another and another, until a small stack sat on the counter between us. For the trouble, I stared at the money, then back at his face. It was more than I'd make in a week. Enough to fix the leaky faucet, to buy Maya that new coat she needed, to breathe for just a moment. But it felt wrong. It felt like payment for a service I hadn't understood I was providing. "I don't want your money," I said, pushing the bills back towards him. His hand covered mine for a fleeting second, his skin calloused and surprisingly warm. It wasn't a threatening gesture, but one of quiet insistence. "It's not a payment, it's a debt. Debts are always paid." He then turned and walked out the door, disappearing into the rain as silently as he had arrived. I was left alone in the echoing quiet of the diner, with $500 on my counter and a terrifying sense of having stepped into a world whose rules I did not understand. I locked the door, my hands trembling, and tested the bolt twice. Then I scooped the money into my apron pocket, the crisp bills feeling both like a blessing and a curse. As I climbed the stairs to my apartment, the floorboards creaking under my feet, I couldn't shake his question. "You have a family?" It wasn't a threat. I realized that now. It was an acknowledgement. He wasn't just a man running from the police. He was a man who understood what was at stake. He knew what I had risked. Lying in bed that night, listening to the soft, even breaths of my daughter sleeping in the next room, I stared at the ceiling and wondered if my act of defiance, my simple, stupid act of compassion, had been a terrible mistake. Had I invited a monster into our lives, or had I unknowingly helped someone who understood the sacred duty of protecting a family? The next morning, the rain had stopped, but a heavy grey mist clung to Ironwood, making the world outside my window feel muffled and unreal. The events of the previous night felt like a dream, a strange, tense fiction my sleep-deprived mind had concocted. But the $500 were real, neatly stacked on my dresser, a silent testament to the choice I had made. I tried to push it out of my mind as I got Maya ready for school. The familiar routine, a comforting anchor in a sea of uncertainty. I braided her hair, made her toast, and listened to her chatter about a class art project. All the while, a knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. What if the police came back? What if the man returned? Opening the diner felt different that day. The familiar space, my sanctuary and my prison, now felt exposed. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret. Every jingle of the bell made my heart leap into my throat. The morning rush was its usual trickle, a few construction workers grabbing coffee, a couple of elderly regulars nursing their breakfast specials. I moved through the motions on autopilot, my smiles feeling brittle and fake. Around 9 o'clock, the bell jingled again. I looked up from the grill, wiping sweat from my brow, and froze. It was him, the man from last night. He was wearing a different suit, a charcoal grey one that was just as immaculate as the last. The cut on his arm was gone, or at least hidden. He looked rested, his face less pale, but his eyes still held that same unnerving intensity. He wasn't alone. Standing just behind him was a younger man, broad-shouldered and silent, his hands clasped respectfully behind his back. The few customers in the diner fell quiet, their conversations dying in their throats. They could feel it too, the sudden shift in the atmosphere, the arrival of something out of place in our world of chipped mugs and cheap coffee. The man walked to the counter and placed a small, ornate box on the formica. It was dark, polished wood, inlaid with mother-of-pearl. "Good morning," he said, his voice as calm and steady as it had been the night before. "I didn't get your name." I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "It's Ilara." "Ilara," he repeated, tasting the name. "My name is Alessandro. This is for you." He slid the box towards me. I stared at it, then at him, a dozen questions swirling in my mind. "What is it?" "A token of my appreciation." "For the coffee?" His face was impassive, but his eyes held a glimmer of something I couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't a threat, but it wasn't simple gratitude either. It was something more formal, more binding. I slowly reached out and opened the box. Nestled on a bed of black velvet was a necklace. It was a simple gold chain, but hanging from it was a single, perfect pearl, lustrous and white. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, more valuable than anything I had ever owned. I looked up at him, speechless. "I can't accept this," I whispered. "It's too much." "It is a small thing," Alessandro said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "For a significant kindness, please. It would be an insult to refuse." An insult. The word hung in the air, heavy and loaded. This wasn't just a gift. It was a symbol, a transaction in a currency I was only just beginning to comprehend. Refusing it, I sensed, would be more dangerous than accepting it. Behind him, the younger man watched me, his expression blank, but his eyes missing nothing. The choice, once again, was mine. But was it really a choice at all? My hand trembled as I lifted the necklace from its velvet bed. The pearl was cool against my skin, its weight a tangible reminder of the invisible threads now connecting my life to this man's. "Thank you," I managed to say, the words feeling inadequate. I didn't want to accept it, but the finality in his tone made it clear that refusal was not an option. It was a gesture of honor from his world, and to reject it would be to break a code I was better off respecting. Alessandro gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of satisfaction. He seemed about to say something more when the bell over the door jingled again, this time with a frantic, jarring energy. It was Mrs. Petrov, my landlord, her face pinched with a familiar mix of impatience and disdain. She owned half the crumbling buildings on this block, and her presence never meant good news. "Ilara!" she barked, ignoring Alessandro and his companion completely, her eyes scanning the diner with disapproval. "I need to talk to you." "Now?" She marched towards the counter, a crumpled piece of paper clutched in her hand. It was the eviction notice. I knew it before I even saw the bold red letters. I was 2 months behind on rent for the diner and the apartment. I had been paying what I could, a little here, a little there, but her patience had finally run out. My stomach plummeted. The $500 on my dresser would cover 1 month, but not both, and it would leave nothing for bills or food. "Mrs. Petrov," I started, my voice shaking slightly. "I was going to come see you today. I have some of the money." "Some isn't all," she snapped, slapping the paper onto the counter right next to the ornate box. "You have 30 days. I've got a new tenant lined up already, someone who pays on time." Her words were loud, deliberately cruel, designed to humiliate me in front of my customers. The few remaining patrons stared down into their coffee cups, their discomfort a palpable thing. I felt a hot flush of shame creep up my neck. All my struggles, all my failures laid bare under the harsh fluorescent lights. I couldn't look at Alessandro. I couldn't bear for him to see this, to see how desperate my situation truly was, but I could feel his gaze. He hadn't moved. He just stood there, a silent observer to my public unraveling. "Please," I whispered to Mrs. Petrov, my pride dissolving into raw desperation. "Just give me a little more time. Business has been slow, but it'll pick up." "I've heard that story before," she scoffed, turning to leave. 30 days, Ilara, then you and your kid are out on the street." She stormed out, the bell clanging violently in her wake. The silence she left behind was suffocating. I stared at the eviction notice, the black and red ink blurring through the tears welling in my eyes. It was over. I had failed. After all this time, all the long hours and sleepless nights, I was going to lose everything. I had lied to the police, accepted a strange gift from a potential criminal, all for nothing. My quiet, precarious life was about to shatter completely. Suddenly, a low voice cut through my despair. "Is there a problem?" It was Alessandro. He was looking at the eviction notice, his expression unreadable. How could I even begin to explain the mountain of debt and fear I was buried under? And why would this man, a stranger from a violent world, even care? I quickly crumpled the eviction notice in my hand, a useless gesture of hiding my shame. "It's nothing," I said, my voice thick with unshed tears. "Just landlord troubles." I tried for a dismissive wave, but my hand was shaking too badly. I didn't want his pity. I didn't want him to see me as a charity case, some pathetic woman he could buy off with expensive trinkets and stacks of cash. My problems were my own, a mess of my own making. Alessandro's gaze didn't waver. He looked from my face to my clenched fist, and I had the distinct feeling he could see right through my flimsy defenses. He seemed to understand the architecture of desperation, the way it hollows you out from the inside. "This woman," he said, his voice dropping to a lower, more serious register. "Mrs. Petrov, she owns this building?" I just nodded, unable to speak. The younger man standing behind him shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, his eyes flicking towards the door. Mrs. Petrov had just exited. Alessandro was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to calculate something complex. He wasn't looking at me with pity, but with a kind of focused assessment, as if my problem were a puzzle he was considering solving. "Ironwood has changed," he mused almost to himself. "There was a time when a woman working to raise a child on her own was respected, protected." The words hung in the air, a strange, old-fashioned sentiment that felt out of place in the modern dog-eat-dog world of my reality. The idea of protection was a foreign concept to me. I had been my own protector, and Maya's, for as long as I could remember. There was no one else. "People like her," he continued, his voice hardening slightly. "They prey on the vulnerable. They forget the old ways. They forget what community means." He picked up the ornate box, closed the lid, and pushed it gently back towards me. "You should wear the necklace," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. It felt like an instruction. "It will suit you." He and his companion turned and left the diner as quietly as they had entered. I stood there, clutching the crumpled notice, my mind reeling. His words echoed in my ears. Protected? What did that even mean? Was it a threat aimed at my landlord? The thought sent a chill down my spine. I had wanted no part of his world, and yet I seemed to be sinking deeper into it. I imagined Alessandro confronting Mrs. Petrov, his quiet intensity and the silent, imposing presence of his younger associate. What would he do? What could he do? The rest of the day passed in a haze of fear and confusion. I was terrified of Mrs. Petrov and the eviction, but now a new, more ambiguous fear took root. I had become entangled in something far beyond a simple act of kindness. This was about codes and debts, respect and protection. I had inadvertently signaled that I was a part of their world, and now it seemed they had claimed me. That evening, as I locked up, I saw a long black car parked across the street. It was sleek and expensive, its tinted windows reflecting the fading light. It didn't belong in Ironwood. It felt like an omen. Was it watching the diner? Was it watching me? My simple life was gone, replaced by a suspense I couldn't escape. Had I traded one kind of precarity for another, far more dangerous one? The black car was there again the next morning, and the morning after that. It never moved, never had anyone get in or out, but it was a constant, silent presence on the periphery of my life. It was a stark reminder that my world was no longer just mine. My days became a tightrope walk of anxiety. Every time the diner door opened, my heart would leap, wondering if it was Mrs. Petrov with another threat, the police with more questions, or Alessandro with another cryptic gesture. The regulars noticed the change in me. "You seem jumpy, Alara," said Mr. Henderson, a retired steelworker who'd been eating breakfast at the same table for 20 years. I just forced a smile and blamed it on a lack of sleep. How could I explain that I felt like a pawn in a game whose rules were written in a language I couldn't understand? The necklace Alessandro had given me sat in its box on my dresser. I couldn't bring myself to wear it, but I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it either. It felt like a contract, a symbol of an alliance I hadn't agreed to. Wearing it felt like acceptance, like pledging allegiance to a flag I didn't recognize. A week after the confrontation with Mrs. Petrov, I was sorting through a stack of bills at the counter, the numbers swimming before my eyes, when she walked in again. My stomach instantly clenched into a tight, cold knot. But this time, her demeanor was different. The usual sneer was gone, replaced by a strained, almost fearful politeness. Her eyes darted around the empty diner, lingering for a second on the street outside, where the black car sat. "Elara," she said, her voice unusually subdued. I wanted to talk to you about the rent." I braced myself for the worst. "I've been thinking," she continued, avoiding my eyes, "and I know things have been tough. We can work something out." I stared at her, stunned into silence. This was the same woman who had gleefully threatened to throw me and my daughter onto the street just days ago. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm willing to forgive the past 2 months," she said quickly, the words tumbling out as if she were trying to get them over with. "Just pay what you can, when you can. Starting from this month, we'll call it even." She was practically wringing her hands, her gaze fixed on a spot on the floor just past my feet. The change was so drastic, so completely out of character that it was terrifying. It wasn't kindness motivating her, it was fear. Raw, unadulterated fear. What had happened? What had Alessandro done? I didn't dare ask. I just nodded, a strange sense of vertigo washing over me. "Okay, Mrs. Petrov, thank you." "Yes, well," she mumbled, already backing towards the door. "Just keep up, all right?" And then she was gone. I sank onto a stool, my legs suddenly unable to support me. The eviction notice, the crushing weight that had been suffocating me for weeks, was gone. Just like that. But this wasn't a reprieve, it was a warning. My problems hadn't been solved, they had been handled by a force I couldn't control or comprehend. I was no longer just a struggling waitress. I was under the protection of Alessandro, and the price of that protection was a terrifying unknown. Looking out the window at the silent watching car, I felt a chilling realization. I hadn't just been saved from drowning, I had been pulled onto a ship, sailing into a storm far greater than the one I had left behind. Was this safety, or was it just a more gilded cage? The days that followed were surreal. The black car remained, a silent guardian at the edge of my vision. Mrs. Petrov avoided me entirely, scurrying past the diner with her head down if she saw me through the window. My most immediate crisis had vanished, but my anxiety had been replaced by a low, humming dread. It was the feeling of being watched, of being managed by invisible hands. It was the unnerving quiet of the sea before a tsunami. I started to notice other, smaller changes. The produce delivery guy, who always gave me the stuff that was about to turn, suddenly started leaving crates of the freshest, most vibrant vegetables, refusing any extra payment with a nervous smile. A persistent leak in the ceiling that Mrs. Petrov had ignored for years was suddenly fixed, repaired by two silent men in work clothes who showed up one afternoon, did the job with quiet efficiency, and left without a word. My world was being subtly, methodically improved, and it was setting my teeth on edge. These weren't acts of charity, they were markers, they were staking a claim. Every unexpected kindness felt like another link in a chain being forged around me. I felt a growing resentment mixed with a toxic gratitude. I was being helped, yes, but I was also being controlled, my independence eroding with every unsolicited favor. I was losing the right to my own struggles. One afternoon, a man I'd never seen before came in. He was young, sharply dressed, and had the same watchful stillness as Alessandro's companion. He sat at the counter and ordered a coffee. "Mr. Gallo sends his compliments," he said, stirring his coffee without drinking it. "He hopes you are well, Gallo." I assumed he meant Alessandro. The formality was chilling. "I'm fine," I said, my voice tight. He also asked me to convey that if you have any other landlord troubles, or any troubles of any kind, you should not hesitate to mention it. He slid a simple, blank business card across the counter. On it was only a phone number written in elegant script. "My name is Marco. I'll be nearby." Nearby, in the black car. The implication was clear. I was being given a direct line to this shadowy organization. I was being offered a key to a door I never wanted to open. I stared at the card. It felt heavier than it should, weighted with unspoken promises and threats. Taking it would be another step, another sign of acceptance. "Thank you," I said, my voice betraying none of the turmoil inside me. "But I don't think that will be necessary." Marco's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, disappointment, surprise, passed through his eyes. "As you wish," he said politely. "But the offer stands. Mr. Gallo believes in looking after his friends." Friends? Was that what I was now? A friend of Alessandro Gallo? It sounded so innocuous, so normal, but I knew it wasn't. Friendship in his world was likely a complex tapestry of obligation and debt. He placed a $20 bill on the counter for the $2 coffee and stood to leave. "He also said to tell you," Marco added, pausing at the door, that the pearl is a symbol of protection. It is meant to be worn. He left. I stood there, my hand hovering over the business card. I wanted to tear it into 1,000 pieces. I wanted to scream that I didn't need their protection, that I could handle my own life. But could I? Hadn't I been drowning before they appeared? This was the insidious nature of their help. It was offered so quietly, so efficiently, that it made my own efforts seem futile. It made me dependent. Slowly, I picked up the card. I didn't tear it up. I slipped it into my apron pocket, where it lay cool and smooth against my hip. Was I keeping it out of fear, or was a part of me, a desperate, exhausted part, relieved to know it was there? Life settled into a new, strange rhythm. The quiet improvements to the diner continued. One morning I came in to find a brand new commercial-grade espresso machine installed, gleaming and silent, where my old, sputtering one used to be. There was no note, no explanation, just an upgrade I could never have afforded, a silent gift that felt more like a leash. The black car became a part of the landscape, as mundane and ever-present as the crumbling brick of the buildings around it. I learned to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't a cage being built around me. I even started to feel a bizarre sense of security. The usual neighborhood toughs who sometimes hassled me for free food or hung around the entrance making customers uncomfortable suddenly vanished. My walk home in the dark, usually a tense, hurried affair, felt different. I felt untouchable. I hated myself for the relief it brought. I was becoming accustomed to the cage. One rainy Tuesday, Maya came home from school with her head down, her small shoulders slumped. She'd been quiet all evening, pushing her food around her plate. Finally, tucked into bed, she confessed. A group of older boys had been bullying her, cornering her in the schoolyard, stealing her lunch money. Today, they had pushed her down, and she'd scraped her knee. My blood ran cold, then hot with a fierce, protective rage. This was the one thing I could not tolerate. My struggles were one thing, but my daughter's safety was sacred. I held her close, promising her I would talk to the school principal first thing in the morning. I would handle it. But as I lay in bed that night, listening to her troubled sleep, a dark thought crept into my mind, unbidden. The business card Marco had given me was still in my wallet. I had transferred it from my apron, unable to throw it away. Any troubles of any kind, he had said. The thought was seductive and horrifying. What would happen if I made that call? A quiet word from Mr. Gallo would undoubtedly stop the bullying instantly and permanently. There would be no parent-teacher conferences, no ineffective wrist slaps from the principal. There would just be a solution. I felt sickened by the temptation. It was a betrayal of everything I believed in. I was her mother. I was supposed to solve her problems through normal means, to teach her resilience and strength. Reaching for that card would be teaching her that power, real power, came from shadowy men in expensive suits. It would mean admitting I couldn't protect her on my own. It would mean paying for their protection with a piece of my soul. I tossed and turned for hours, the dilemma tearing me apart. On one side was my pride and my principles. On the other was the raw, primal urge to protect my child by any means necessary. The phone number on that card represented a terrible power, a shortcut through the messy, unjust struggles of life. It was a poison that promised to cure the disease. By morning, I was exhausted but resolute. I would not make the call. I would go to the school. I would fight this battle the right way, my way. I had to believe that my own strength was enough. But as I walked Maya to school, my hand holding hers tightly, I couldn't help but glance at the black car parked in its usual spot down the street. It seemed to watch us, a silent, potent question. How much was I willing to endure before I reached for the power they were so willing to give? The meeting with the principal was as frustrating and useless as I had feared. Mr. Davies was a man buried under bureaucracy, his responses a string of platitudes about anti-bullying policies and peer mediation. He promised to look into it, which I knew was code for doing nothing. I left the school feeling deflated and angry, the fire of my maternal rage dampened by the wet blanket of institutional indifference. Maya's bullies would get a talking to at best, and their behavior would likely only get worse, more cunning. As I walked back to the diner, my steps were heavy with defeat. The world felt stacked against people like me, people without power or influence. My principles felt thin and foolish in the face of my daughter's tears. That afternoon, Marco came into the diner. He didn't sit down, he just stood by the counter, his presence instantly filling the small space with a quiet authority. "Mr. Gallo was concerned," he said, his voice low. "He heard there was an issue at your daughter's school." My blood froze. How? How could he possibly know? Had they been following me? Was my entire life, even a private meeting at my daughter's school, under their surveillance? The cage was smaller and more confining than I had even imagined. "It's being handled," I said, my voice cold and clipped. I was furious. This intrusion was a violation, a quiet stripping away of my privacy and autonomy. Marco raised a placating hand. "Of course, no one is questioning your ability to handle your own affairs, but Mr. Gallo is a traditional man. The well-being of children, it is a matter of particular importance to him." He paused, letting the words sink in. "He believes that some problems require a more direct solution, one that ensures they do not happen again." There it was again, the offer, the dark, simple path. I thought of Maya's scraped knee, of the fear in her eyes. I thought of the principal's useless promises. The anger at the bullies, at the school, at my own powerlessness began to bubble up, warring with my fear of Alessandro and his world. "What are you offering?" I asked, the words tasting like poison. "A conversation," Marco said smoothly. "A quiet word with the fathers of the boys involved. A reminder of the importance of respect. Nothing more. Nothing more." But I knew that a quiet word from Alessandro Gallo would carry the weight of an anvil. It would be a message delivered in a language those men would understand perfectly. It would solve the problem, but at what cost? What would I owe them in return? What part of myself, of my daughter's life, would I be signing over to them? "I need you to understand," Marco continued, his voice soft but firm. "This is not about putting you in our debt. For Mr. Gallo, this is a matter of principle. A child was harmed in his neighborhood. That is an imbalance that must be corrected. It is a question of honor." Honor? He kept using that word. It seemed to be the central pillar of their strange, violent code. They paid their debts, they protected children, they corrected imbalances. It was a perverse kind of community service, a twisted form of civic duty. I was at a crossroads, a place where my values were crashing headfirst into my most primal instincts. Could I truly turn down an offer that guaranteed my daughter's safety and peace of mind? Was my moral purity more important than her happiness? The question was a physical weight in my chest, and I didn't know the answer. I stood there in the quiet diner, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Marco's offer hanging in the air between us. It was a lifeline and a noose all at once. I looked past him, out the window, at the grey, indifferent street. I had tried to do it the right way. I had played by the rules of a system that was never designed to protect people like me. And I had failed. My daughter was still afraid. "All right," I heard myself say, the word coming out as a dry whisper. It felt like a surrender, a confession of my own inadequacy. "Have your conversation." Marco's expression remained unchanged, but I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not triumph, but a kind of solemn acknowledgement. He had offered the power, and I had accepted it. The transaction was complete. He gave a single, sharp nod. "It will be handled. You have Mr. Gallo's word." He turned and left without another word. I watched him get into the passenger side of the black car, which then pulled silently away from the curb and disappeared around the corner. A profound sense of dread and relief washed over me in equal measure. I had done it. I had invited the wolves in to protect my lamb. The next day, Maya came home from school humming, a bright, genuine smile on her face for the first time in weeks. "The boys weren't at school today, Mommy," she said, swinging her backpack onto a chair, "and everyone was really nice to me." I felt a chill, despite the warmth in her voice. It was done, so quickly, so quietly. I couldn't bring myself to ask any more questions. I didn't want to know the details of the conversation that had taken place. I just hugged her, soaking in her relief, trying to ignore the sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. The black car did not return. For the first time in weeks, the street outside my diner looked ordinary again, but its absence was more unnerving than its presence had been. It meant the surveillance was over because I was no longer a person of interest. I was one of them. I had accepted their help. I was under their protection, and by extension, under their authority. A few days later, Alessandro Gallo came to the diner. This time, he was alone. He sat at the counter, and I poured him a coffee without him having to ask. We sat in silence for a few moments. "Your daughter?" he said finally, his voice gentle. "She is well?" "She is," I answered, my voice quiet. "Thank you." He waved a hand dismissively. "It was a small thing, a matter of neighborhood hygiene. Weeds must be pulled before they choke the garden." His analogy was both chilling and strangely poetic. He saw himself as a gardener of this broken neighborhood, tending to it with methods that were both brutal and in their own way nurturing. "I want to pay you," I said, the words coming out in a rush. "For everything, the rent, the repairs, the other thing. I don't have much, but I can pay you back over time." Alessandro looked at me, a genuine, sad smile touching his lips for the first time. "Ilara," he said, his voice soft, "you already paid. That night, in the rain, you paid in advance." He reached into his pocket and placed something on the counter. It was a small, faded photograph of a young woman with dark, smiling eyes holding a baby. "My daughter," he said, "and my granddaughter. They live across the country. I don't see them enough." Suddenly I understood. The protection, the debt, it wasn't about me, not entirely. In me and Maya, he saw his own family. Protecting us was a way of protecting them, of enforcing a code of honor that he hoped would somehow keep his own loved ones safe in a dangerous world. This realization didn't lessen my fear, but it complicated it. He wasn't a monster. He was a grandfather. He was a man living by a code, trying to create a small pocket of order and justice in a world he saw as chaotic and predatory. But the tools he used to create that order were fear and violence. He was both the shepherd and the wolf. And I was now, inextricably, part of his flock. Was there any way to be grateful for the safety he provided without becoming complicit in the methods he used to achieve it? The conversation with Alessandro changed everything. The fear didn't vanish, but it was joined by a fragile, terrifying understanding. I was no longer just a recipient of his strange, dangerous charity. I was a symbol. My well-being and Maya's had become entwined with his own personal code of honor. I started wearing the pearl necklace. It felt like the right thing to do, a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken pact between us. It was a beautiful, heavy weight against my skin. Life found a new, precarious normal. The diner was doing better than ever. News of my good fortune, however mysterious, had spread through the neighborhood's gossip network. People seemed to think the diner was under some kind of lucky star, and they flocked to it. Perhaps they sensed the same aura of untouchability that I did. I was able to pay my bills, put fresh food on the table every night, and even start a small savings account for Maya. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living on the edge of a financial cliff, but the comfort was tainted. Every dollar I put in the bank felt like it had been laundered through a system of fear and intimidation. I was prospering in the shadow of a power I still didn't fully comprehend. One evening, as I was closing up, a young man stumbled into the diner. He was barely a man, maybe 19, with fear-wild eyes and a crudely tattooed spiderweb on his neck. He was clutching his side, and a dark stain was spreading across his thin t-shirt. He looked like one of the neighborhood kids who had fallen in with a local street gang, a sad, familiar story in Ironwood. "Please," he gasped, leaning heavily against the counter. "You gotta help me. They're after me." Behind him, I heard the sound of screeching tires and angry shouts. A carload of other young men, members of a rival gang, had pulled up outside. They were getting out, armed with bats and pipes. This was different from Alessandro. This was not the quiet, controlled power of an old-world organization. This was the chaotic, unpredictable violence of desperate young men. My first instinct was to scream, to tell him to get out, to take his trouble with him. I had Maya upstairs. I had a life that was finally, fragilely stable. This kid and his gang war could burn it all to the ground. He looked at me, his face pale with pain and terror, and in his eyes I saw the same desperate plea I had seen in Alessandro's that first night. Help me. The choice was the same, but the stakes felt different. Alessandro was a powerful man, a man who commanded respect and fear. This was just a stupid, scared kid who had made all the wrong choices. Helping him offered no benefit, only risk. The men outside were pounding on the door now, their shouts echoing in the empty diner. "We know he's in there! Send him out!" I looked at the kid, then at the stairs leading up to my apartment, to my sleeping daughter. My newfound safety, the protection I had accepted, was about to be tested. Did Alessandro's protection extend to this? Would his name be a shield against this kind of random, street-level violence? Or had I just been protected from one specific threat, only to be left vulnerable to all the others? The pounding on the door grew louder, more violent. I had to decide. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. The men outside were going to break the door down. I looked at the terrified boy bleeding on my floor, and then at the phone in my hand. I could call the police, but I knew they'd be too late. The violence would be over long before the sirens ever arrived. There was only one other call I could make. My fingers trembled as I pulled the blank business card from my wallet. It felt like I was lighting a signal fire, calling on forces I couldn't control. I dialed the number. It rang only once. "Yes?" Marco's voice was calm, clipped. "It's Ilara," I said, my voice shaking. "At the diner, there's trouble. A boy is hurt. There are others outside. They're trying to get in." I didn't need to say more. "Lock the back door," he commanded, his voice sharp with urgency. "Go upstairs. Stay away from the windows. We are 5 minutes away." The line went dead. 5 minutes. It felt like a lifetime. The pounding on the front door turned into a splintering crash as the glass cracked. The boy on the floor whimpered, curling into a ball. I did as I was told. I ran to the back, threw the heavy deadbolt, and then scrambled up the stairs to my apartment, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I locked the apartment door behind me and ran to Maya's room. She was still asleep, oblivious. I stood over her, my body trembling, every muscle tensed for the sounds of violence from downstairs. The shouting from the street grew louder, more chaotic. I heard the shattering of the front window. They were inside. I could hear them yelling, overturning tables, my diner, my life being torn apart. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for Maya, praying for the boy downstairs, praying for the arrival of my terrible, necessary saviors. And then I heard it, a new sound. The deep, powerful roar of multiple car engines arriving at speed. I heard doors slam. The shouting outside changed its tone from aggressive and confident to surprised and fearful. Then there was a new voice, a calm, authoritative one, cutting through the chaos. I couldn't make out the words, but the effect was immediate. The noise from my diner stopped. A heavy, tense silence fell. After what felt like an eternity, I heard a single set of footsteps on the stairs. A soft, polite knock came at my apartment door. "Ilara, it's Marco. It's over. You can come down now." My legs were weak as I unlocked the door. Marco stood there, his suit immaculate, not a hair out of place. He gave me a small, reassuring smile. "It's all right. They're gone." I followed him downstairs. The diner was a wreck. Tables were overturned, Broken glass littered the floor. But the gang members were gone. The wounded boy was being tended to by a man in a dark suit who was expertly bandaging his side. Outside, I saw 2 black cars. The rival gang was lined up against the wall, held there by several other silent, imposing men. And in the center of it all, standing under a streetlight like an actor on a stage, was Alessandro Gallo. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't even looking at the gang members. He was talking quietly to the oldest one, the leader, his hands in his pockets. He was calm, conversational, but the young man was pale and trembling, nodding his head at whatever Alessandro was saying. He was giving them a lesson in territory, in respect, a lesson that my diner, and by extension this entire block, was now under his protection. He had drawn a line in the sand. I had called, and they had come. They had answered. The relief was so overwhelming it almost brought me to my knees. But as I looked at the scene outside, the fear on the young men's faces, the quiet, absolute power being wielded by Alessandro, I knew I had crossed a final line. I was no longer an innocent bystander. I was a part of this. My call had summoned them. My fear had sanctioned their methods. Had I saved a life tonight, or had I merely traded one kind of violence for another, more powerful one? The cleanup was unnervingly efficient. Within the hour, a team of men had arrived. They weren't the imposing figures who had dealt with the gang. These were older men, carpenters and glaziers, who moved with a quiet, practiced purpose. They swept up the glass, righted the tables, and boarded up the broken window and door, their work illuminated by the headlights of the black cars that now formed a silent, protective perimeter. The wounded boy had been taken away, not in an ambulance, but in one of the cars, to a place where, I was assured, he would receive proper care without any official records. The rival gang had been dispersed, sent on their way with a final, chillingly calm warning from Alessandro. He never raised his voice, but the terror he instilled was more potent than any shout. When it was all over, he walked into the diner, surveying the temporary repairs. "This will all be fixed by morning," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. A new door, new glass, better than before. I just stood there, wrapped in a blanket Marco had given me, too stunned to speak. "You did the right thing calling," he said, looking at me, his eyes searching my face. "You trusted us. That is important." Trust. It felt like a strange word for what I was feeling. It was a cocktail of fear, dependence, and a terrifying, undeniable gratitude. I hadn't trusted him. I had been desperate. But in his world, perhaps they were the same thing. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice small. "To the boy, to the others. The boy will be mended," Alessandro said, "and he will be given a choice, a different path. As for the others, they have learned a lesson about respecting the peace of this neighborhood. They will not be trouble again." It was all so simple for him. Problems were identified, and they were solved. People were broken, and they were mended or discarded. The world was a chaotic machine, and he was a master mechanic, tightening the loose bolts, removing the faulty parts. He was the reason my daughter was safe, the reason I still had a business, the reason a young man wasn't bleeding to death in an alley. He was also the reason a group of other young men were now living in fear, their lives forever altered by a single conversation. I was living in a paradox, benefiting from a system of justice that operated entirely outside the law. My small diner had become the unlikely heart of a protected territory, an unofficial embassy of Alessandro Gallo's quiet kingdom. And I, the struggling waitress, had become something more. I was the reason this territory existed. My initial act of kindness of hiding him from the police had been a test of character, and by passing it, I had unwittingly nominated myself for this role. My diner wasn't just a diner anymore. It was a symbol of his code, a place where a debt was honored, where protection was extended, where the old ways still meant something. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale grey light over Ironwood, I stood in my patched-up diner, the smell of sawdust in the air. The black cars were gone. The workmen were gone. It was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of a fortress after a siege. I had survived the battle, but I was no longer a free citizen. I was the keeper of the keep, living under the flag of a king I had never meant to serve. The question was no longer whether I could escape his world. The question was, what was my role in it now? The next morning, I opened the diner later than usual. A brand new glass window and a sturdy new door had been installed, as promised. The place was cleaner than it had been before the attack. There was no sign of the previous night's chaos except in my memory. I was wiping down the counter, my movements slow and robotic, when the bell above the new door jingled. My first thought was that it was Alessandro or Marco, but it wasn't. It was a man in a simple, well-kept suit, someone I didn't recognize. He smiled kindly and took a seat at the counter. A moment later, the bell jingled again, another man, then another, then two more. Within 10 minutes, a silent procession had begun. Dozens of men, all in dark suits, began to file into my small diner. They were young and old, some with faces as weathered as Alessandro's, others with the smooth, impassive expressions of men like Marco. They didn't speak. They simply entered, found a seat at a table or at the counter, and waited patiently. My diner, which could maybe hold 30 people comfortably, was suddenly filled to capacity. The room was thick with a quiet, respectful energy. They weren't here to intimidate me. They were here for something else. My heart hammered in my chest. This was it. The other shoe was finally dropping. This was the payment I had been dreading. What were they going to ask of me? To launder money? To hide fugitives? To become a permanent fixture in their criminal enterprise? Finally, Alessandro Gallo walked in. The sea of men parted for him as he walked to the counter. He placed a thick, sealed envelope on the polished surface in front of me. "Ilara," he said, his voice resonating in the hushed room. "That first night, you saved more than just my life. You saved my honor. Had I been arrested that night, a great many things would have been thrown into chaos. An agreement, a promise I had made to a dying friend to keep this neighborhood stable, would have been broken." He gestured to the men filling every seat in my diner. These men, they are business owners, family men, grandfathers. They are the community that my friend asked me to watch over. They are the barbers, the bakers, the contractors, the ones who fixed your ceiling and your door, the ones who want their children to grow up on safe streets. I stared at him, then at the faces in the crowd. I recognized some of them now from a distance. The man who owned the Italian bakery, the contractor who ran a small construction firm, the old man who ran the social club on the next block. They weren't mobsters in the way I had imagined. They were the fabric of this neighborhood, a hidden network bound by old-world loyalties. "We are not what you think we are," Alessandro continued, his voice soft. "We are simply a family, and we look after our own. When you protected me, you protected all of us. You showed honor when you had every reason to show fear. And for that, the family owes you a debt." He pushed the envelope towards me. "This diner is on a month-to-month lease. The building is old. Mrs. Petrov was going to sell it to a developer who would have torn it all down for luxury condos. We have convinced her to sell to a new owner." My breath hitched. I slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a deed, a legal, official deed to the entire building. The diner, my apartment, the two other storefronts on the ground floor. It was all in my name. Ilara Rossi, paid in full. Tears streamed down my face as I looked up at him, unable to speak. "Debts are always paid," he said simply, with that same sad smile. "You are one of us now, Ilara. Not by force, but by character. This is your home, this is your business, and you and your daughter will never have to be afraid again. You have my word." The men in the diner didn't applaud, they just watched, their faces filled with a quiet, profound respect. In that moment, I understood. I hadn't been pulled into a world of crime. I had stumbled into a family, a strange, dangerous, and fiercely loyal family that operated by its own ancient, unbreakable code. I had given a desperate man a cup of coffee and a moment of sanctuary, and in return they had given me a future. Thank you for watching. The smallest act of kindness can sometimes ripple outward in ways we can never predict. Have you ever experienced or witnessed an unexpected reward for a simple act of compassion? Share your story in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories that explore the hidden corners of human connection, be sure to subscribe for more.